Let's talk about one of the most unlikely villains in American moral panic history. Picture this: a basement in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, 1974. A group of friends gather around a table covered with hand drawn maps, polyhedral dice, and stacks of typed pages. They're not plotting revolution or summoning demons, they're playing a game. A game that would soon be blamed for teenage suicide, accused of being a recruitment tool for Satanism, and denounced from pulpits across America as a gateway to hell itself. This is the story of Dungeons and Dragons, and how a hobby born from the imagination of a deeply religious man would become the center of one of the most fevered moral panics of the 1980s. It's a tale that reveals as much about American culture, religious fear, and media hysteria as it does about the power of imagination to both inspire and terrify. Usually in these videos, I play the games we're talking about, but since this is a tabletop game, I've decided to play a game that's based on it: Golden Sun for the Game Boy Advance. Before we get into it, let's talk about some fun facts about Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons was the first commercially successful tabletop role-playing game, an open-ended storytelling experience where one player creates scenarios for others to navigate using improvisation, dice rolls, and imagination. The game's iconic polyhedral dice were borrowed from educational supply companies, where they were used as teaching tools for geometry classes. The very name Dungeons and Dragons was chosen by Gary Gygax's young daughter from a list of potential titles when she was just 2 years old. The game's artwork, later scrutinized for satanic imagery, was largely influenced by classical mythology and 1970s fantasy art. Many of the game's moral systems were rooted in Judeo-Christian concepts of good and evil. The alignment system encouraged players to consider the ethical implications of their actions. Gary Gygax deliberately avoided having clerics worship the God of the Bible because he respected his religion too much to mix it with a game. His religion was Jehovah's Witnesses. To understand the bitter irony of D&D's later controversies, you need to know about Gary Gygax's religious background. Born Ernest Gary Gygax in Chicago in 1938, he and his wife Mary Jo became active Jehovah's Witnesses in the early years of their marriage. As a practicing Jehovah's Witness, Gygax actually went door to door, spreading his faith, and his religious beliefs influenced many aspects of early D&D design. When Gygax created the cleric class, he deliberately avoided having them worship the God of the Bible because he respected his religion too much to mix it with the game. The paladin class, a holy warrior archetype, was rooted in Christian concepts of righteous battle against evil. The game's fundamental structure was built around a cosmic struggle between good and evil, with players typically cast as heroes fighting against darkness. This religious foundation made the later accusations of Satanism particularly painful for Gygax. His connection to D&D and the resulting satanic associations, combined with his smoking and drinking habits, created friction with his Jehovah's Witness congregation. Smoking is a banned activity, and smoking even once is enough to get a person permanently shunned. Eventually, the family disassociated themselves from the religion. He continued to value his faith, keeping a Bible with him and citing Matthew 5:15-16 as favorite verses shortly before his death in 2008. The man who created a game that would be accused of promoting devil worship maintained his Christian beliefs, a fact that highlights the tragic misunderstanding at the heart of the D&D controversy. D&D emerged from the wargaming community of the early 1970s, where enthusiasts gathered to recreate historical battles using miniature figures and complex rule systems. Gygax and his collaborator Dave Arneson took this concept and added something revolutionary. Instead of commanding armies, players would control individual characters with distinct personalities, abilities, and motivations. The game was revolutionary, not just for its content, but for its format. Unlike board games with fixed outcomes and predetermined paths to victory, D&D was open-ended. There was no single way to win, no board to traverse, no finish line to cross. Success was measured in storytelling, problem-solving, and collaborative creativity. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. Players created characters by rolling dice to determine attributes like strength and intelligence, chose a class like fighter or wizard, and then embarked on adventures guided by a dungeon master who served as a narrator, a referee, and the voice in the game world. The polyhedral dice, borrowed from educational supply companies, provided the randomness that made each game session unpredictable. What made Dungeons and Dragons truly special was its emphasis on imagination over components. While other games required expensive boards, pieces, and accessories, Dungeons and Dragons could be played with nothing more than paper, pencils, dice, and creativity. This accessibility helped the game spread rapidly through word of mouth in gaming clubs, college campuses, and friendship networks. The game's first publication in 1974 was modest, a set of 3 booklets in a wood grain box, sold primarily through hobby shops and gaming conventions. But within a few years, Dungeons and Dragons had spawned a cottage industry of supplements, accessories, and competing games. More importantly, it had created an entirely new form of entertainment that blended elements of theater, literature, and gaming into something unprecedented. The tragedy that would transform Dungeons and Dragons from an obscure hobby into a national controversy began with James Dallas Eggbert III, a 16-year-old computer programming prodigy at Michigan State University who disappeared into the steam tunnels beneath the campus in August 1979. Eggbert suffered from depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety, mental health conditions that were poorly understood and inadequately treated in 1979. He'd also been struggling with drug use and the social isolation that often accompanies intellectual giftedness. The steam tunnels where he disappeared were indeed a place where he and other students sometimes played Dungeons and Dragons, but this was merely coincidental to the deeper issues driving his distress. When Egbert's family hired private investigator William Deere to find their son, Deere found Dungeons and Dragons materials in the room and theorized, incorrectly, that the game had driven the young man to madness. Deere suggested that Eggbert might have entered the campus steam tunnels while playing a live-action version of D&D, though this theory was largely unfounded. In reality, Eggbert had entered the tunnels in distress and contemplating suicide, unrelated to any gaming activity. Eggbert was found alive after hiding with friends, but tragically succeeded in taking his own life a year later in 1980. Despite clear evidence that his problems stemmed from untreated mental illness rather than gaming, the narrative that D&D was responsible had already taken hold. Deere capitalized on the case with his 1984 book, The Dungeon Master, which sensationalized the D&D connection. Even more influential was Rona Jaff's 1981 novel, Mazes and Monsters, adapted into a 1982 movie starring Tom Hanks. The film portrayed role-playing games as a dangerous obsession that could drive players to suicide and violence, cementing these fears in popular culture. The timing could not have been worse for D&D's growing community. The early 1980s were a period of heightened anxiety about youth culture, coinciding with rising concerns about drugs, teen suicide, and the influence of popular culture on children. American society was primed for a moral panic, and D&D had inadvertently positioned itself as the perfect scapegoat. Every moral panic needs its champions, and D&D found its most formidable opponent in Patricia Pulling, a mother whose personal tragedy would fuel a decade-long crusade against role-playing games. In June 1982, Pulling's 16-year-old son, Irving, committed suicide after returning home from his high school in Hanover County, Virginia. Irving had been an avid D&D player, and his mother became convinced that the game was responsible for his death. Pulling founded an organization called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, or B.A.D., which became the primary vehicle for anti-D&D activism throughout the 1980s. B.A.D.'s message, spelled B.A.D.D., was uncompromising and terrifying to parents. Pulling argued that D&D players were at risk of becoming involved in dangerous behaviors, linking the game to occult practices and self-harm. Pulling argued that D&D's manuals were so detailed in their occult content that they could only have been written by people with extensive knowledge of real witchcraft and Satanism. She collected anecdotal evidence of other young people who'd played D&D and later committed violent acts or suicide, building what appeared to be a compelling case for the game's dangerous influence. What made Pulling's crusade particularly effective was her credentials and presentation. She wasn't a fringe religious figure or obvious zealot. She was an articulate, educated mother who had experienced devastating loss. Her grief was genuine. Her concern for other children appeared heartfelt, and her arguments were packaged in the language of child protection rather than religious doctrine. B.A.D.'s influence extended far beyond individual families. Schools began banning D&D clubs. Libraries removed gaming materials from their shelves. And some law enforcement agencies received training on recognizing occult crime that specifically mentioned role-playing games as warning signs. The organization's public service announcements and educational materials spread internationally, fueled by the broader satanic panic that was gripping American culture. No single piece of anti-D&D propaganda was more influential or ultimately more unintentionally hilarious than Jack Chick's 1984 comic tract, Dark Dungeons. Chick Publications had been producing evangelical comic strips since the 1960s, covering various perceived threats to Christian youth, including rock music, drugs, and now role-playing games. The 22-page comic told the story of Debbie and her friend Marcy, college students who join a D&D-style gaming group. The comic portrayed the game as a recruitment tool for real witchcraft, showing players learning actual spells and being invited to join covens. When Marcy's character dies in the game, she commits suicide in real life, leading Debbie to blame the game for her friend's death. The comic featured memorable dialogue that became unintentionally comedic to gaming communities, including dramatic revelations that D&D was part of a vast occult conspiracy. While intended as a serious warning about spiritual dangers, Dark Dungeons became a cult classic among gamers who appreciated its over-the-top paranoia. The tract was distributed worldwide and translated into multiple languages, making it possibly the most widely circulated piece of anti-gaming literature ever produced. Churches handed out copies at Halloween, left them in waiting rooms, and mailed them to concerned parents. For many people, Dark Dungeons was their first and only exposure to information about role-playing games. What made the comic particularly effective was its format. The visual storytelling made complex accusations accessible to readers of all ages, while the dramatic narrative structure created emotional impact that dry statistics or theological arguments couldn't match. It transformed abstract fears about occult influence into a concrete story with relatable characters and clear moral lessons. To understand the D&D controversy fully, it must be placed within the broader context of the satanic panic that gripped America throughout the 1980s. This period was characterized by widespread fear that organized satanic cults were infiltrating American institutions and targeting children for abuse and recruitment. The panic extended far beyond role-playing games to include daycare centers, heavy metal music, certain toys and cartoons, and even some mainstream books and movies. Cases like the McMartin preschool trial, where daycare workers were accused of ritualistic child abuse, created a climate where almost any unusual behavior or interest could be interpreted as evidence of occult influence. Law enforcement agencies received training on recognizing occult crime, which often included playing role-playing games as a potential warning sign. Some police departments established special units to investigate ritualistic crimes. Mental health professionals reported increased numbers of patients claiming to be survivors of satanic ritual abuse, though most of these claims would later be discredited. The media coverage often treated unsubstantiated allegations as fact and gave platforms to self-proclaimed experts whose credentials were questionable. The same dynamics that drove coverage of the D&D controversy, sensational claims, frightened parents, and dramatic visuals, fueled broader fears about occult influences in American culture. This context helps explain why D&D faced such intense scrutiny. The game wasn't just being evaluated on its own merits, but was seen as part of a larger pattern of dangerous cultural influences. For people who believed that satanic forces were actively targeting American children, a game featuring demons and magic spells seemed like obvious evidence of the threat. By the mid-1980s, D&D had become a regular fixture in news coverage about youth problems, teen suicide, and occult influences in American culture. In 1985, a segment on the prestigious CBS News program 60 Minutes featured the controversy, giving national attention to claims that D&D was driving teenagers to violence and suicide. The media coverage followed a predictable pattern. A young person who played D&D would commit a violent crime or take their own life, and reporters would highlight the gaming connection while downplaying other factors like mental illness, family problems, or substance abuse. Over approximately 5 years in the 1980s, activists cited 28 cases of adolescents who played D&D and later committed murder or suicide, though these numbers were not supported by independent research. The numbers were provided by B.A.D., which, for obvious reasons, should be viewed with skepticism. Television talk shows, news magazines, and local newspapers ran sensational stories about the occult game that was corrupting America's youth. The coverage often relied on interviews with concerned parents, anti-gaming activists like Patricia Pulling, and law enforcement officials who had received training about quote-unquote occult crime. Rarely did these stories include perspectives from mental health professionals, game designers, or the vast majority of players who had never experienced any negative effects. The visual elements of D&D, the medieval imagery, the monster illustrations, the polyhedral dice, made for compelling television and print coverage. News producers could easily create dramatic visuals by filming dice rolling, showing monster artwork, or focusing on players in character. The game's fantasy elements looked exotic and potentially sinister to audiences unfamiliar with the hobby. Perhaps most damagingly, the media coverage often failed to distinguish between correlation and causation. The fact that troubled teenagers sometimes played D&D was treated as evidence that D&D caused their problems, rather than considering that creative, intelligent young people might be drawn to both role-playing games and to darker forms of expression when they were struggling with serious issues. While the moral panic raged, researchers were quietly examining the actual statistical evidence for D&D's alleged dangers. When scholars finally analyzed the data, they revealed a striking truth. There was no evidence that D&D players were more likely to commit suicide than other teenagers, and some evidence suggested they might actually be safer. By the 1980s, millions of teenagers were playing D&D in the United States. When researchers compared suicide rates among players to the general adolescent population, they found no increased risk. The game appeared to be protective rather than harmful, likely because it provided social connection and creative outlets for young people who might otherwise be isolated. By the early 1990s, the CDC reviewed youth suicide data and found no elevated risk among D&D players. The American Association of Suicidology and Health and Welfare Canada reached similar conclusions, finding no evidence to support claims that D&D caused psychological harm. The statistical reality contradicted the activist claims that had fueled the moral panic. The statistical reality made sense when you considered what D&D actually involved: creative problem solving, social interaction, collaborative storytelling, and engagement with moral and ethical questions. For many young people, especially those who felt isolated or different, gaming groups provided community, friendship, and a sense of belonging. The hobby attracted intelligent, creative teenagers who might otherwise have spent their time alone. Research also revealed the selection bias in the reported cases. Troubled teenagers were more likely to be drawn to any form of escapist entertainment, whether that was D&D, heavy metal music, science fiction, or other subcultures that allowed them to explore complex emotions and ideas. When these young people experienced crisis, their hobbies became convenient explanations for problems that had much deeper roots. As the controversy intensified, TSR, or Tactical Studies Rules, the company that published D&D, found itself in an impossible position. The company faced numerous lawsuits from families claiming that D&D had caused their children's deaths, though none of these legal challenges successfully proved the game was responsible for suicide or violence. In response to the pressure, TSR made significant changes to Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, released in 1989. All references to demons and devils were removed, along with assassination abilities and certain spells deemed controversial. These elements wouldn't be restored until the 3rd edition was published in 2000. TSR executive James Ward explained the company's approach, noting that, quote, avoiding the angry mother syndrome has become a good, basic guideline for all of the designers and editors at TSR Inc., end quote. The company had essentially decided that avoiding controversy was more important than maintaining creative integrity. The changes went beyond content to marketing and presentation. TSR began emphasizing the educational benefits of role-playing games, highlighting how D&D could improve reading skills, mathematical abilities, and social development. The company sponsored research into the positive effects of gaming and worked to distance itself from any imagery or language that might be construed as occult or violent. Local game stores reported harassment and boycotts. Gaming conventions faced protests and sometimes had to hire additional security. Some manufacturers of gaming accessories found their products banned from certain retail chains. The entire hobby industry felt the economic impact of the moral panic. Individual players and dungeon masters also faced personal consequences. Students were suspended from school for bringing D&D materials to campus. Some players lost jobs when the employers discovered their hobby. Others faced family conflict or social ostracism in their communities. The stigma associated with role-playing games would persist long after the height of the controversy. One of the most fascinating aspects of the D&D controversy was how it divided Christian communities. While organizations like B.A.D. and evangelical groups condemned the game, other Christians defended it or remained neutral. The irony was not lost on some observers that a game created by a Jehovah's Witness and built around Christian concepts of good versus evil was being attacked as satanic. Some Christian gamers formed organizations to promote Christian gaming or to develop role-playing games with explicitly biblical themes. Others argued that D&D itself was compatible with Christian values when played responsibly, pointing out that the game typically cast players as heroes fighting against evil forces. The controversy revealed deeper tensions within American Christianity about engaging with popular culture. Conservative evangelicals often took the position that any cultural product containing references to magic, demons, or non-Christian religions was inherently dangerous. More moderate Christians argued for discernment and believed that fantasy literature and games could be enjoyed as fiction without compromising one's faith. The D&D controversy also highlighted different approaches to child rearing within Christian communities. Some parents believed in strict isolation from potentially corrupting influences, while others favored teaching children to engage critically with culture while maintaining their faith commitments. The game became a symbol of these competing philosophies. What made the D&D moral panic so effective wasn't just the sensational media coverage or the organized activism. It was how the controversy tapped into deep-seated psychological and cultural anxieties that had been building throughout American society. The 1980s were a time of rapid social change, and many parents felt they were losing control over the influences shaping their children's lives. The game's very format made it threatening to traditional authority structures. Unlike movies, books, or television shows that had clear creators and distributors who could be held accountable, D&D was collaborative and open-ended. Parents couldn't preview the content their children would encounter because much of it was improvised during play. The dungeon master, often another teenager, wielded a kind of creative authority that many adults found unsettling. The hobby also attracted precisely the kind of young people who are most likely to question traditional values and explore alternative ideas. Intelligent, creative, introspective teenagers who often felt like outsiders in their schools and communities. These are the kids who read fantasy novels, listened to progressive rock music, and showed interest in subjects like mythology and comparative religion. For parents who were already concerned about countercultural influences, D&D seemed like a natural gathering point for exactly the wrong crowd. The game's emphasis on imagination and role-playing also challenged certain religious worldviews about the nature of identity and spiritual influence. Some Christian parents worried that pretending to be a wizard or casting fictional spells might somehow open their children to actual demonic influence. These concerns reflected deeper theological questions about the relationship between imagination and spiritual reality that different Christian traditions answered in different ways. The polyhedral dice themselves became symbols of occult influence in the minds of critics. Unlike the familiar six-sided dice used in family board games, the geometric shapes used in D&D looked exotic and mysterious. Some opponents claimed these dice were specifically designed for use in occult rituals, unaware that they were actually mathematical tools borrowed from educational supply companies. As the controversy intensified, a cottage industry developed around occult experts who claimed specialized knowledge about the dangers of role-playing games. Many of these individuals had questionable credentials but presented themselves as authorities on subjects ranging from adolescent psychology to religious studies to criminal investigation. These self-proclaimed experts often provided the academic veneer that media outlets needed to justify their sensational coverage. Detective Sandy Gallant of the San Francisco Police Department became a frequent speaker at law enforcement conferences about quote-unquote occult crime, including seminars that warned officers to watch for D&D materials as potential evidence of satanic activity. These training sessions often mixed legitimate concerns about actual criminal activity with unfounded speculation about the influence of popular culture. Some mental health professionals joined the chorus of concern, but their voices were often amplified beyond their actual expertise. Therapists who treated troubled teenagers might mention that their patients played D&D, but this correlation was frequently cited as evidence of causation by activists and media outlets looking for expert validation of their fears. The most influential anti-gaming activist was arguably Patricia Pulling herself, who, despite having no formal training in psychology, criminology, or gaming, was frequently invited to speak as an authority on the dangers of role-playing games. Her personal experience with tragedy gave her emotional credibility, but her conclusions about D&D's role in youth problems were based on grief and activism rather than systematic investigation. These expert voices created an echo chamber where unfounded concerns were validated and amplified. Parents who might have been skeptical of purely religious objections to D&D were more likely to take seriously warnings that came from people with medical degrees or law enforcement experience, even when those warnings weren't based on rigorous research. While the moral panic raged in mainstream media and parents' organizations, the gaming community developed its own strategies for survival and resistance. Game stores learned to be discreet about D&D merchandise, sometimes keeping the most controversial materials behind counters or in back rooms. Gaming groups met in private homes rather than public spaces, and players became careful about discussing their hobby outside of trusted circles. The underground nature of gaming during this period actually strengthened community bonds in many ways. Players felt they were part of a persecuted minority, defending something valuable against ignorant attackers. And they were right. This siege mentality fostered intense loyalty to the hobby and deep friendships within gaming groups. Gaming magazines like Dragon and different company newsletters became lifelines for isolated players, providing not just new game content, but also moral support and practical advice for dealing with anti-gaming sentiment. These publications ran articles on how to explain D&D to concerned parents, how to respond to religious objections, and how to find other players in hostile environments. Some gamers organized letter writing campaigns to counter negative media coverage, though their voices were often drowned out by the more sensational claims of critics. Others focused on documenting the positive aspects of their hobby, collecting stories of friendships formed, creativity developed, and social skills improved through gaming. The gaming industry also quietly supported research into the actual effects of role-playing games, funding studies that would eventually provide the statistical evidence needed to counter the moral panic's claims. However, this research took years to complete and publish, meaning that the community had to weather the storm largely without scientific validation. Even as the initial wave of anti-D&D sentiment began to fade in the early 1990s, many of the myths and misconceptions created during the moral panic proved remarkably persistent. Urban legends about gamers who became so immersed in their characters that they lost touch with reality continued to circulate long after being debunked. Stories about players committing suicide when their characters died remained part of gaming folklore, despite the lack of documented cases. The association between role-playing games and social dysfunction became so embedded in popular culture that it influenced media portrayals of gamers for decades. Movies and television shows routinely depicted D&D players as socially awkward misfits or potential criminals, reinforcing stereotypes that had been created during the moral panic. Some of the institutional policies created during the controversy also outlasted the fears that had motivated them. School districts that had banned D&D clubs were slow to reverse those decisions, even after the game gained mainstream acceptance. Libraries that had removed gaming materials from their collections often never bothered to replace them. The therapeutic and educational applications of role playing games were also delayed by the lingering stigma from the moral panic. Mental health professionals who might have recognized the value of gaming techniques were hesitant to incorporate them into their practice for fear of parental backlash or professional criticism. Perhaps most significantly, the moral panic created a generation of parents who remained suspicious of role playing games, even as their own children became interested in the hobby. These secondhand fears, based on half remembered news reports from the 1980s, continued to influence family decisions about gaming well into the 2000s. The intellectual redemption of D&D began in universities, where researchers in fields ranging from psychology to education to digital media studies started taking serious academic interest in role playing games. Early studies focused primarily on debunking the negative claims that had driven the moral panic, but gradually the research evolved to explore the positive potential of gaming. Educational researchers found that role playing games could be powerful tools for teaching everything from history to mathematics to foreign languages. The collaborative problem solving required in D&D sessions developed skills that transferred to classroom settings and real world situations. Students who participated in gaming activities showed improved creativity, enhanced social skills, and better understanding of complex narrative structures. Psychologists discovered that the identity exploration inherent in role playing could have therapeutic benefits for adolescents struggling with social anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges. The safe space provided by gaming groups allowed young people to experiment with different aspects of their personalities and practice social interactions in low stakes environments. Communication studies scholars recognize D&D as a sophisticated form of collaborative storytelling that demonstrated principles of narrative construction, audience engagement, and creative collaboration. The game's emphasis on shared world building and character development provided insights into how groups create meaning through interactive narrative. Anthropologists and sociologists found rich material in gaming culture, studying how communities form around shared interests and how subcultures develop their own values, languages, and traditions. The persecution that gamers had experienced during the moral panic became a case study in how societies create and maintain boundaries between acceptable and deviant behaviors. This academic attention gradually rehabilitated D&D's intellectual reputation and provided the scholarly foundation for its eventual mainstream acceptance. When universities began offering courses in game design and interactive media, role-playing games were finally recognized as legitimate subjects of serious study rather than dangerous diversions. As TSR struggled with the fallout from the moral panic throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the company's approach to content and marketing underwent dramatic changes that reflected broader shifts in the entertainment industry. The sanitized version of D&D that emerged from this period was safer and more family-friendly, but players felt it had lost some of the creative edge that had made the original game so compelling. When Wizards of the Coast acquired TSR in 1997, the new ownership brought a different philosophy to D&D's development and marketing. Wizards had experience with trading card games and understood how to build and maintain gaming communities without triggering the kinds of controversies that had plagued TSR. The company began the gradual process of restoring some of the content that had been removed during the moral panic, while being careful to frame everything in terms of heroic fantasy rather than occult themes. The introduction of the D20 system and the Open Gaming License in 2000 represented a revolutionary approach to intellectual property that allowed other companies to create compatible games and supplements. This strategy helped spread D&D's influence throughout the gaming industry while reducing the company's direct responsibility for controversial content created by third parties. Wizards also invested heavily in digital platforms and online communities, recognizing that the internet provided new opportunities for gaming groups to form and for the hobby to spread beyond its traditional word of mouth networks. Online tools for character creation, virtual tabletops for remote play, and streaming platforms for sharing gaming sessions all help normalize the hobby and make it more accessible to mainstream audiences. The company's approach to community management reflected lessons learned from the moral panic years. Rather than being reactive to criticism, Wizards developed proactive strategies for engaging with parents, educators, and other stakeholders who might have concerns about gaming. The company sponsored research into the positive effects of role playing games and actively promoted the educational and social benefits of the hobby. By the 2010s, the cultural transformation of D&D was complete and remarkable. The game that had once been banned from schools was now being used as an educational tool in classrooms around the world. Teachers discovered that D&D sessions could teach collaboration, creative writing, problem solving, and basic mathematics in a way that traditional pedagogical approaches couldn't match. The rise of actual play podcasts and streaming shows like Critical Role introduced millions of people to the role playing games through carefully curated presentations that emphasize the collaborative storytelling and social bonding aspects of the hobby. These shows featured articulate, charismatic players who demonstrated that gamers could be creative professionals rather than basement dwelling outcasts. Celebrity endorsements from actors, musicians, and other public figures helped normalize gaming culture and counteract lingering stereotypes from the moral panic era. When mainstream celebrities began talking openly about their D&D games and the positive role that gaming had played in their lives, it became much harder to maintain that role-playing was a dangerous fringe activity. The therapeutic applications of role-playing games gained recognition from mental health professionals who'd overcome their earlier hesitations about gaming. Specialized therapy groups using D&D techniques were developed for treating social anxiety, PTSD, autism spectrum disorders, and other conditions where traditional talk therapy had proven less effective. Perhaps most significantly, the parents who'd grown up during the moral panic began to reach adulthood and have children of their own. Many of these parents had firsthand experience with D&D and could offer balanced perspectives based on actual knowledge rather than media-fueled fears. This generational shift in parental attitudes provided the foundation for the hobby's current mainstream acceptance. The D&D moral panic offers enduring lessons about how societies process technological and cultural change. The pattern that emerged in the 1980s, tragic incident, simple explanation, media amplification, institutional response, has been repeated with video games, social media, and other new forms of entertainment and communication. Understanding how the D&D controversy developed and eventually dissipated provides insights into the psychology of moral panics and the importance of maintaining perspective during the periods of cultural anxiety. The statistical evidence that eventually vindicated role-playing games was available from the beginning, but it took years for rational analysis to overcome emotional reactions and sensational coverage. The case also demonstrates the resilience of creative communities and the power of grassroots advocacy in defending cultural innovations against organized opposition. The gaming community's persistence in developing and promoting their hobby despite facing significant social and economic pressure ultimately proved more powerful than the fear-based campaigns of their critics. Perhaps most importantly, the D&D controversy illustrates how imagination and creativity can become battlegrounds for broader cultural conflicts about values, authority, and social change. The game itself was never really the issue. It was a symbol for deeper anxieties about generational differences, religious authority, and the pace of cultural transformation in American society. The vindication has been significant and widely recognized. However, there are still fringe conspiracy theorists who demonize it. By the 2020s, the game enjoys massive mainstream success with celebrity players, educational applications, therapeutic uses, and cultural recognition that would have seemed impossible during the darkest days of the moral panic. The hobby that was once accused of corrupting American youth is now celebrated as a tool for developing creativity, building community, and exploring complex moral and ethical questions. Gary Gygax, who was a Jehovah's Witness during the early years of D&D and was eventually accused of promoting devil worship, remained a person of faith throughout his life. His creation outlived the controversies that surrounded it, proving that imagination and faith need not be enemies. The game born in a Wisconsin basement became a global phenomenon that continues to bring people together around the simple but powerful act of collaborative storytelling. In the end, the D&D moral panic may be remembered not as a legitimate concern about cultural dangers, but as a cautionary tale about the power of fear to override evidence as the importance of defending creative expression against those who would censor what they don't understand. Proof that sometimes the most subversive thing you can do is invite people to imagine something better. Thanks for listening.